Have you ever started something with fire in your heart, only to watch that fire slowly dim into embers? Maybe it was a new habit, a spiritual practice, or a promise you made to yourself. You began with passion, with clarity, with certainty that this time you'd stay committed. And yet, somewhere along the way, the spark faded. It's a story as old as humanity itself. We make vows, we set intentions, we feel inspired. And then we forget. We get tired. Life gets in the way. But why? Why does something that once felt so important become a burden? Why do we lose motivation on the very path that we believed would save us? In the world of Buddhist practice, this question isn't new. It's been asked by monks sitting alone in forests, by lay practitioners kneeling at their altars, and even by the Buddha himself during his long and difficult journey to enlightenment. Today, I want to take you on a journey through this question, not just to understand why motivation fades, but how we can live and practice even when it does. Because the truth is, motivation isn't permanent. It's a visitor, a guest in the house of your mind. And like all guests, it comes and goes. When we understand this, when we stop chasing constant inspiration and instead learn how to walk through both light and shadow, something beautiful happens. We stop being slaves to our moods, and we become steady, grounded travelers on the endless road of awakening. So before we dive deep, let me ask you something. When was the last time you truly felt alive in your practice? When was the last time you sat in meditation, or read a sacred text, or took a mindful breath, and it felt effortless? Like your heart and the universe were speaking the same language. And if you can't remember, that's okay. Because you are not alone. In fact, if you've ever struggled to stay motivated in your practice, it means you're walking the same road that every sincere practitioner has walked since the beginning of time. The path of practice is long. It is winding. And it will test you. It will offer you moments of deep peace and clarity, and then it will take them away. It will give you glimpses of joy, followed by stretches of emptiness. And every time you stumble, every time your heart feels heavy, you'll be faced with a choice. Do I continue? Or do I stop? This is the heart of the spiritual journey. And yet, so many of us believe that losing motivation means we've failed. That if we don't wake up every morning eager to meditate, or if we skip a day of chanting, or if we feel restless during a Dharma talk, something's wrong with us. But let me tell you something the ancient teachers knew. Even losing motivation is part of the practice. In the Dhammapada, one of the earliest collections of the Buddha's teachings, it's written, "Like a fish thrown upon dry ground, our mind flounders in the face of craving. Strive hard." The Buddha didn't say, "Stay motivated at all times." He said, "Strive," which means keep going whether you feel like it or not. Because real practice isn't about chasing bliss. It's about showing up for yourself, for this world, and for this very moment. So, why do we lose motivation? The reasons are many and they are human. We get attached to results. We want progress to be fast, easy, and visible. When it isn't, we get discouraged. We compare ourselves to others. We see teachers, monks, or even friends who seem so serene, so wise, so unwavering, and we think, why am I not like that? What's wrong with me? We get caught in old habits. The inertia of daily life pulls us away from our intentions. We wake up and check our phones before we check our hearts. We fill our days with noise, distractions, small urgencies that steal away our attention. And sometimes, we simply don't understand what practice truly is. We think it's about feeling peaceful, or becoming better than others, or reaching some perfect state where we no longer suffer. But practice is none of those things. It's about seeing the truth of your own mind moment by moment. It's about being honest with yourself, even when that truth is uncomfortable. And in that honesty, we find freedom. Because once we recognize that motivation will rise and fall, that our mind will wander, that we will sometimes forget the path, we stop judging ourselves for it. Instead, we learn to return, over and over again, to this breath, to this step, to this sacred, ordinary moment. and that, more than any grand burst of inspiration, is the true heart. In our last chapter, we spoke of the endless journey, of the fire that flickers, the motivation that fades, and the ancient truth that losing heart is not a failure, it's part of the path. But before we can understand how to stay steady, even when motivation disappears, we need to ask a deeper question. What exactly is practice? And what does it mean to walk the true path? Because here's the thing most people misunderstand, and it's not their fault. We live in a world obsessed with results, a world that asks, what did you achieve? How far have you come? How many hours did you meditate? How pure is your mind? But Buddhist practice isn't a checklist. It isn't about becoming better than others. It isn't even about becoming better than yourself. It's about waking up. And waking up, my friend, isn't something that happens once and then you're done. It's not a finish line you cross. It's a process that unfolds in every ordinary sacred moment. So what is practice? In the simplest terms, practice is the art of returning. Returning to what? To the present moment, to awareness, to your own heart. Not because the moment is always beautiful, but because it's always real. The Buddha himself called this path the middle way, a life lived between extremes, not chasing pleasure, not drowning in denial, but walking steadily, one breath at a time, through the rich, messy, beautiful, and often painful reality of being alive. And the nature of practice is that it isn't separate from life. You don't practice only when you're sitting cross-legged on a cushion, or chanting ancient verses, or listening to a Dharma talk. You practice when you wash the dishes, when you hold your child's hand, when you feel anger rising in your chest and pause just for a moment to witness it instead of reacting. You practice when you forget, and then remember. The great Zen master Dogen once said, "When you walk in the mist, you get wet, even though you don't realize it." That's what true practice is. It's not dramatic. It doesn't always feel spiritual. It's in the quiet, unnoticed moments that slowly reshape your heart. And perhaps that's why we struggle with motivation, because we imagine practice to be something grand. We think enlightenment must arrive like thunder, with flashing lights and a perfect, unshakable peace. But in truth, awakening often feels like nothing. It feels like washing a cup in silence, noticing a bird call, sitting with grief without trying to fix it, feeling joy without trying to hold on to it. It's so simple, so ordinary that the ego, always craving fireworks, overlooks it. So let me tell you something radical you've already been practicing. Right now, as you listen to these words, as you notice your breath, as you hear your thoughts, as you feel whatever you're feeling, this is practice. The difference is now you're aware of it. And this awareness, this gentle noticing, is the ground of everything. In Buddhism, we often speak of the Eightfold Path: right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. But if you ask the masters, they'll tell you you don't have to master them all at once. You begin wherever you are. You begin with what's in front of you. And perhaps the most important step is right effort, not forcing, not striving in desperation, but making steady, balanced effort with patience, kindness, and humility. Because effort in practice isn't about making yourself feel a certain way. It's about showing up. The Thai forest monk Ajahn Chah once described practice like carrying a heavy bucket of water. At first, it hurts your arms. You want to drop it, but if you keep carrying it, you get stronger. And eventually, you realize the bucket has holes. The water was never yours to hold forever. The practice was in carrying it. And so it is with your heart. The practice isn't to be permanently calm or endlessly motivated. It's to stay present with whatever arises, to see anger as anger, joy as joy, fear as fear, and to meet it all with compassion. This is what it means to walk the true path. Not to escape life, but to enter it fully, awake, honest, vulnerable. And when you understand this, you realize something else. You can't actually fall off the path, because the path isn't somewhere else. It's not a monastery in the mountains. It's not in perfect discipline or holy robes. It's right here, in your mess. In our last chapter, we spoke about practice as the art of returning, not chasing perfection, not grasping for lightning bolts of enlightenment, but showing up again and again with an open, steady heart. And we ended with a truth that's both beautiful and difficult. You can't fall off the path because the path is your life itself. But if that's true, if the path is always here, why do we still lose motivation? Why is it that one day we wake up early, meditate, feel clear and inspired, and the next day we feel empty, restless, tired, disconnected? What makes that fire dim? Let's talk about it. Because Buddhism never promised this journey would be easy. In fact, the Buddha himself warned of the obstacles that every practitioner, from monks to ordinary people, will face. In the ancient texts, these obstacles are called the 5 hindrances, and whether you've heard the term or not, you've definitely met them. Let's meet them now one by one. 1. Sensual desire, kamikanda. The craving for pleasant experiences. It sounds harmless. What's wrong with enjoying life? But the issue isn't pleasure itself, it's the attachment to it. The way we chase temporary highs, a delicious meal, a new gadget, an addictive scroll through social media, a compliment that lifts our ego. And when those moments fade, as they always do, we feel flat, unmotivated. We tell ourselves, maybe practice isn't working. I'll feel better after a snack or one more video. Desire isn't bad, it's natural, but when it controls us, it pulls us off center. 2. Ill will, vyapada. This one hides in plain sight. It's the irritation you feel when someone interrupts your meditation, the resentment when life doesn't go your way, the anger at yourself for not doing better. Ill will clouds the heart. It makes motivation shrink because we start practicing from a place of frustration instead of compassion. 3. Sloth and torpor, thinamita. A heavy, dull, sluggish state. Have you ever sat down to meditate and felt your eyelids droop within minutes? That dense fog in the mind, the sense of why bother. It's not just physical tiredness, it's a spiritual heaviness, a lack of clarity. And it's one of the greatest thieves of motivation. 4. Restlessness and worry, udakakakaka. The opposite of torpor, a mind that won't sit still, thoughts bouncing like a pinball machine. What should I do next? What did I forget? What if I fail? This restless state pulls us out of the present moment. It makes practice feel impossible because instead of being here, we're everywhere else. 5. Skeptical doubt, visikika. Perhaps the most dangerous one. Not healthy curiosity, but corrosive, paralyzing doubt. Is this really worth it? Am I wasting my time? Will I ever feel peace? This kind of doubt freezes our effort. It turns practice into a chore. It convinces us that maybe we're broken, that maybe we're just not spiritual enough. But here's the good news. The Buddha didn't list these hindrances to shame us. He named them so we could recognize them. Because what you can see clearly, you can let go. And that's where motivation lives, not in avoiding obstacles, but in learning how to meet them. There's a beautiful teaching in the Zen tradition. The obstacle is the path. It means that whatever is blocking you is your teacher. The anger you feel, a chance to practice patience. The craving that tugs at you, a chance to practice letting go. The doubt that whispers in your ear, a chance to practice faith, not blind faith, but trust in your own capacity to begin again. Because motivation isn't something you either have or don't. It's a flame you tend. And some days it burns high. Other days it's a single flickering ember. Both are part of the practice. There's a story of a monk who asked his master, "Why do I keep losing motivation to practice? I feel inspired one day, empty the next." And the master replied, "A mountain has both sunny and cloudy days, yet it remains the mountain. Your motivation will rise and fall, but you remain the mountain. The key is not to believe that cloudy days mean you failed. They're part of the weather of practice. And here's the secret. On those cloudy days when you don't feel like practicing, when doubt shouts loudest, when you feel heavy and restless, those are the most precious moments. Because those are the moments you grow." In our last chapter, we uncovered the obstacles, those hidden forces that dim our motivation and cloud the path. We learned about desire, ill will, sloth, restlessness, and doubt. And most importantly, we discovered that these hindrances aren't signs of failure, but signs of being human. Now comes a crucial question. How do we recognize when motivation is slipping away? Because the truth is, it rarely vanishes all at once. It fades slowly, quietly, like the tide pulling back from the shore. And if we don't pay attention, we only notice it once we're standing in the cold, empty sand, wondering how we drifted so far. But the wise practitioners throughout history knew something important. The earlier you notice, the easier it is to return, to catch yourself before you've wandered too deep. So in this chapter, let's explore the subtle signs, the quiet whispers that tell us motivation is beginning to fade. And maybe they'll sound a little familiar. 1. The quiet voice of resistance. It starts so softly you almost miss it. I'll meditate tomorrow. I'm too tired tonight. Just 5 more minutes on my phone. These small postponements aren't harmless. They're the first pebbles that start an avalanche. The danger isn't in skipping one session. It's in the pattern, in letting those small moments pile up until practice feels like a burden instead of a refuge. The moment you hear that voice of resistance, pause, not with judgment but with curiosity. Ask yourself gently, what am I running from right now? 2. Emotional numbness. Sometimes, the loss of motivation doesn't show up as obvious avoidance. It appears as indifference, a sense that nothing really moves you anymore. You sit in meditation but feel empty. You read sacred texts and the words feel flat. You listen to a Dharma talk and your mind drifts elsewhere. This emotional numbness is a warning light. It means your heart's connection to practice has thinned, not because you're broken, but because something inside you is calling for care. In Buddhism, we're taught that feelings are like weather. They change. But when numbness lingers, it's time to check in with yourself. Have I been pushing too hard? Am I trying to force results instead of letting practice unfold? Sometimes, losing motivation is a signal to soften, to reconnect with joy, to remember why you began this path in the first place. 3. Turning practice into a chore. One of the most subtle signs is when practice shifts from a sacred space to a checklist task. You sit down, but your mind says, okay, let's get this over with. You chant, but you're counting the minutes. You bow, but your heart's not in it. This is dangerous territory, because while discipline is beautiful, mindless discipline hardens the heart. It turns practice into performance. When you notice this happening, pause, reignite a sense of presence, even if it's just for one breath, because one sincere breath is more valuable than 1,000 empty rituals. 4. Increased restlessness and distraction. Another sign is an increase in craving for distractions. Suddenly, the silence of meditation feels unbearable. You find yourself reaching for your phone, seeking noise, stimulation, escape. In Buddhist psychology, this is called uddhacca, mental restlessness. It often masks deeper discomfort, anxiety you don't want to face, loneliness, old wounds surfacing. The loss of motivation isn't the problem here. It's a symptom. The real practice is to turn toward that restlessness with kindness, to sit with it, to ask it what it's trying to protect you from. Because sometimes we lose motivation not because we're lazy, but because something inside us is aching. 5. Doubting the value of the practice. Perhaps the most dangerous sign is when you begin to quietly question whether practice even matters. You think, am I really changing? Does this really work? What's the point? This is visakkhikkha, skeptical doubt, and it's one of the 5 hindrances for a reason. It cuts the roots of motivation. But here's a truth you need to hear. Doubt isn't the enemy. In fact, honest doubt can lead to deeper wisdom if you face it. It only becomes destructive when you run from it or let it silently poison your effort. When doubt arises, don't suppress it. Name it, sit with it, question it kindly. You might find that behind the doubt is simply fatigue or fear, and once seen clearly, it loses its grip. The beauty of awareness. Why does recognizing these signs matter so much? Because awareness changes everything. The moment you notice you're losing motivation, you've already begun to reclaim it. You've stepped out of autopilot and back onto the path. In Buddhism, mindfulness isn't about being perfect. It's about seeing clearly, noticing when you've strayed without self-criticism. Because here's a secret every long-time practitioner learns: you will lose motivation many times, and that's not a failure. That's part of the journey. The key is how quickly you notice it, and how gently you invite yourself back. As Zen master Shunryu Suzuki once said, each time you return to your breath. In our last chapter, we uncovered the subtle signs that motivation is slipping away, not with judgment, but with compassionate awareness. Because as every seasoned practitioner learns, losing motivation is not a flaw. It's part of the path. But once you recognize it, what do? How do you not only rekindle that flame, but learn to keep it alive when winds of doubt, restlessness, and daily chaos threaten to blow it out? Today, let's explore ancient wisdom and modern insights to help you regain and sustain motivation, not through force, not through guilt, but by learning how to fall in love with your practice all over again. 1. Return to your original intention. The Buddha once said, "Remember why you first set your foot upon this path." When motivation fades, it often means we've drifted too far from our original heart. So pause, close your eyes, and ask yourself, why did I begin this journey? Was it to find peace, to heal, to better understand yourself, to ease the suffering of others? Write it down, feel it, name it, because your original intention is a powerful spark. It's not just a memory, it's a living force. And every time you reconnect with it, it breathes life back into your effort. 2. Start small but consistent. When motivation drops, our instinct is often to either force ourselves into long, exhausting sessions or give up entirely. Both are mistakes. In Buddhist practice, there's a teaching called gradual cultivation. It means small, steady steps. If meditation feels heavy, sit for 1 sincere minute. If reading scripture feels dull, read 1 verse with your whole heart. If you can't manage deep compassion, offer 1 kind thought to yourself. Because small, consistent effort has a secret power. It bypasses resistance. As Zen master Dogen wrote, "A drop of water, if it falls consistently, will pierce stone." You don't need to move mountains, just keep the drops falling. 3. Refresh your practice. Sometimes, what we mistake for lost motivation is actually boredom from routine. We're creatures of habit, and while discipline is beautiful, it must be balanced with freshness. The Buddha encouraged adapting practice to conditions. If sitting meditation feels stale, try walking meditation. If formal practice is difficult, practice mindful dishwashing, mindful breathing while commuting, or offering a silent blessing to strangers on the street. Read a new Dharma book. Visit a temple or meditation group. Listen to a talk from a teacher you've never heard before. Buddhist practice isn't a cage. It's a living, breathing path meant to be renewed. When you refresh the outer form, the inner flame often rekindles itself. 4. Surround yourself with spiritual friends. In the Pali Canon, the Buddha said to his attendant Ananda, "Spiritual friendship is the whole of the holy life." Why? Because the people we surround ourselves with either water our motivation or drain it. When you feel your spark fading, seek out those whose light still burns. A conversation with a fellow practitioner, a Dharma group, even an online community of sincere seekers, not to compare yourself, but to remember you are not alone. Motivation thrives in community, because when your flame weakens, others can help shield it from the wind until it grows strong again. 5. Reflect on the fruits of practice. Sometimes we lose motivation because we forget how far we've come. So take a quiet moment. Look back. How has practice softened your anger, helped you manage anxiety, made you more patient, kind, or awake to small joys? We often overlook the subtle transformations because they don't arrive with fanfare. But if you pause, you'll realize you're not the same person you were when you began. Even small shifts matter. They're proof that the path works, and reflecting on those fruits can reignite the desire to walk further. 6. Accept the ebbs and flows. Here's a paradox every practitioner must embrace. You don't need constant motivation to continue. The Buddha taught that everything, including motivation, rises and falls. Some days you'll feel inspired. Other days dry as dust. Both are part of the practice. The goal isn't to cling to motivation but to build resilience, to practice anyway, not as punishment but as kindness to yourself. Because often, the most transformative sessions aren't the easy ones, but the ones where you showed up when you least wanted to. And in those moments, something deep inside you grows strong. 7. Use inspiration wisely. Motivation often returns when you're reminded of the bigger picture. A story from a teacher, a line of scripture that pierces your heart, a moment of unexpected beauty in nature. So, collect what inspires you. Keep a small notebook or digital folder of quotes, images, memories, and teachings that uplift your spirit. On days when your flame flickers, turn to it, not as a crutch, but as gentle encouragement. The ancients called this skillful means, using what works to guide the mind back toward awakening. Regaining and sustaining motivation isn't about forcing yourself to. In our last chapter, we explored practical ways to reignite and sustain your motivation. Small steps, spiritual friendships, and remembering your original intention, each a gentle flame to guide you forward. But here's a truth every seasoned practitioner eventually faces. No matter how strong your motivation is today, it will fade again. Not because you're weak, not because you're failing, but because it's the nature of all things to rise and fall. Today, we uncover one of the most liberating teachings in the Dharma, the wisdom of accepting the natural ebb and flow of your inner life. 1. The impermanence of everything. The Buddha's very first sermon included a core truth. All conditioned things are impermanent. That means not just your thoughts, your feelings, or your circumstances, but also your motivation. It's like the tides of the ocean, sometimes high, sometimes low, sometimes calm, sometimes stormy. The problem isn't that motivation fades. The suffering comes when we cling to it, wishing it would stay, or judging ourselves when it leaves. True wisdom is learning to ride these waves, not drown in them. 2. The trap of constant peak performance. Modern culture loves to glorify hustle, grind culture, endless optimization. There's an unspoken message. If you're not always motivated, you're falling behind. But this is a delusion. Even the Buddha himself withdrew into solitude during difficult times. Even the greatest monks and masters write about days of doubt and dryness. Your spiritual path isn't a corporate productivity chart. It's a living rhythm, one that includes both blossoming and barrenness. And here's the secret. The barren seasons are just as valuable as the abundant ones. 3. Learning from the low moments. When your motivation ebbs, it's easy to see it as failure. But Buddhism invites us to ask a deeper question. What is this moment teaching me? Maybe your restlessness points to unexamined desires. Maybe your boredom is an opportunity to practice patience. Maybe your weariness is a chance to learn gentleness with yourself. As Zen master Shunryu Suzuki famously said, when you feel discouraged, that is a good time to practice. Why? Because it's in those raw, honest moments that our practice stops being a performance and becomes real. For the middle way between striving and slacking. The Buddha's path is famously called the middle way, a balance between indulgence and harsh discipline. When motivation fades, many people swing too far in one direction, either abandoning their practice or forcing themselves through it like a punishment. But there's a wiser option. Practice lightly. If your usual hour-long meditation feels impossible, sit for 5 sincere minutes. If you can't find motivation for deep contemplation, offer one kind thought to yourself before sleep. The middle way honors your human limits while gently keeping you connected to your path. It says, some days you'll soar, some days you'll crawl, both are walking the way. 5. Trusting the rhythm of the path. One of the most beautiful metaphors in Buddhism is the image of the lotus. It grows in muddy water, its leaves close at night and open with the sun. No one scolds the lotus when it closes. It's simply part of its nature. Your motivation, too, follows a rhythm. Periods of intense insight will be followed by plateaus. Moments of bliss will be followed by restlessness. This isn't a flaw in your practice. It's a feature. Because each phase prepares you for the next. And as long as you stay present, no moment is wasted. 6. Turning acceptance into wisdom. Accepting the ebb and flow of your inner life doesn't mean giving up. It means shifting your focus from trying to control the tides to learning how to sail them. In Buddhist terms, this is called equanimity, a calm, balanced mind that neither clings to pleasure nor fears discomfort. When you accept that motivation will come and go, you stop chasing it like a shadow. You start practicing because it matters, not because it always feels good. And paradoxically, when you stop demanding constant inspiration, you open yourself to deeper, steadier forms of joy. 7. The deeper motivation beneath the surface. Here's a final thought. Beneath the flickering surface of daily moods lies something deeper, a quiet, enduring wish, the yearning to live wisely, kindly, and freely. This is what the ancients called bodhicitta, the awakened heart. It's not always loud, but it's steady. And even when your conscious motivation falters, this deeper intention keeps you on the path. Trust it. Like a hidden current beneath the waves, it carries you forward even when you can't feel it. So today, if your motivation feels distant, if your practice feels dry, remember this too is part of the way. It doesn't mean you're lost. We have traveled together through the ups and downs of motivation, from understanding why it fades to learning how to gently bring it back, from recognizing its natural rhythms to embracing the wisdom in every ebb and flow. Now, as we come to the close of this journey, remember this: the path of practice is not a sprint, it's a lifelong walk. Some days your steps will be light and joyful, other days heavy and unsure. Both are sacred, because each step, no matter how small, is a victory. 1. The practice is your home. You don't practice to become perfect. You practice to come home, to a place inside yourself where patience, kindness, and clarity live. It's a sanctuary waiting for you even on days when you feel lost. Your practice is not about achieving a certain feeling or state. It's about showing up, again and again, with an open heart. 2. Cultivate patience and compassion. As you walk this path, be patient with yourself. There will be moments when motivation shines bright, and moments when it flickers and dims. Both are natural. Both are part of your growth. Instead of fighting the hard days, greet them with compassion. Offer yourself the same kindness you'd give a dear friend. 3. Let go of expectations. Sometimes we hold on to rigid ideas of what practice should look like. But true freedom comes when you let go of expectations, of how much you should meditate, how focused you should feel, or how enlightened you must become. Practice isn't about meeting goals. It's about embracing the present moment, exactly as it is. 4. Keep the flame alive. Motivation is like a flame, sometimes bright, sometimes faint. Your job is not to force it into a raging fire, but to keep it alive with gentle care. Remember your why, connect with your community, refresh your practice when needed, and most importantly, keep walking. Because every step forward, no matter how slow, leads you closer to awakening. 5. A final invitation. So dear friend, wherever you are on this path, whether you feel inspired or weary, remember this: you are not alone. You are part of a timeless journey, a journey of growing, falling, rising, and blossoming. Keep walking, keep practicing, keep returning home to the truth within you, and one day you'll look back and realize this journey itself was the destination. Thank you for walking this path.